Picture the most dangerous man in the world. Not dangerous in the soft, modern sense of that word. Not a man with money, or influence, or the legal authority to end your life from across an ocean with a keystroke. Dangerous in the oldest, most primal sense. Dangerous the way a storm at sea is dangerous. The way a cliff edge in fog is dangerous. Dangerous the way that makes every animal instinct in your body light up at once and scream, "Run." Now, picture that man standing at the edge of a forest. He is not running. He is not attacking. He is not doing any of the things that made his name a synonym for violence across 4 continents and 3 centuries of recorded history. He is standing absolutely still, his hand tight around the shaft of an axe that has split shields from Norway to North Africa, and he is staring into the tree line. And he is afraid. Not cautious, not wary, not professionally alert in the way that trained fighters learn to move through hostile territory. Afraid. The deep, wordless animal kind of afraid that does not respond to courage or training or theological conviction, because it is older than all of those things. Older than language, rooted in the part of the human nervous system that exists specifically to keep you alive. When your rational mind has given up trying to understand what is happening to you, the sounds from the forest are not sounds he has ever heard before. They are rhythmic, they are many, they are getting closer. And then, out of the darkness between the trees, something comes. Not an army, not a formation. Not anything that can be understood through the tactical frameworks that Norse warriors spent their entire lives building and refining and testing in the blood of their enemies across the known world. Something else. Something that does not fight the way anything is supposed to fight. Does not fear the things that everything is supposed to fear, and does not stop coming no matter what the man with the axe does. His name was Thorfinnur Karlsefni. He was, by every available measure, the most accomplished explorer and expedition commander in the Norse world at the turn of the first millennium of the Common Era. He was wealthy. He was connected. He had sailed oceans that most people in Europe did not yet believe existed. He had commanded men who were themselves capable of extraordinary violence and extraordinary endurance. Men who had crossed the North Atlantic in open boats through weather that would destroy a modern sailing vessel. Men who had fought and killed and survived things that do not survive the telling in polite company. And in the year approximately 1004 of the Common Era, on the eastern coast of a landmass that would not be named for another 500 years, Thorfinnur Karlsefni turned his people around and went home. He never came back. Neither did any other Norse expedition ever again. The most feared maritime warriors in the history of the medieval world encountered something in the forests of eastern North America that they could not conquer, could not negotiate with, could not outmaneuver, and could not physiologically process within the frameworks of their worldview. And they left. Permanently, they abandoned a continent. This is the story they did not teach you in school. Not because it is obscure, though it has been obscured systematically for reasons we will get to, but because the full truth of what happened when the Norse met the people they called Skrælings is stranger, more complex, and more illuminating about the nature of civilization, power, and the limits of military supremacy than the simplified version that shows up in textbooks ever allows. Because the Skrælings were not savages who got lucky. They were the inheritors of 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge, strategy, and cultural sophistication on a continent that the Norse were seeing for the first time. They were not barbarians encountering civilization. They were the masters of a world the Norse had blundered into without preparation, without understanding, and without the slightest awareness of just how badly outnumbered and outclassed they were. And when the dust settled, when the Sagasas fell silent, when the longships turned east, when the fires at Lance Os Meadows went cold, it was not the Norse who had won. It was the people the Norse had dismissed with a word that did not even try to understand them. Before we go further, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. It genuinely matters to see how far these stories travel. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden histories that rewrote everything we thought we knew about the ancient world, hit like and subscribe so you never miss one. To understand what the Norse encounter with the Skrælings meant, you have to understand what the Norse were before that encounter. Not the romanticized version, not the horned helmet fantasy that Hollywood built, and that has absolutely nothing to do with archaeological reality. The actual Norse. The peoples as they were, with all the complexity and brutality and sophistication and innovation that their actual history contains. The Norse emerged from Scandinavia as a recognizable cultural force in the late 8th century of the Common Era. And within a generation, they had done something no other people in the medieval world had managed. They had made the entire coastline of Europe afraid to go to sleep. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE is the traditional beginning of the Viking Age, and it is a useful starting point. Not because it was the first Norse raid, it almost certainly was not, but because of the shock it produced in the literate world of Christendom. Lindisfarne was a monastery on a tidal island off the northeastern coast of England. It was, by the standards of its time, a place of extraordinary cultural prestige. Home to some of the finest manuscripts in the Christian world, the burial place of Saint Cuthbert, a center of learning that attracted scholars from across Europe. It was also completely defenseless. The Norse knew this in the way that apex predators know things, not through intelligence gathering in any formal sense, but through the accumulated experience of generations of sailors who had spent centuries reading coastlines, identifying wealth, and understanding the relationship between visible defenselessness and accessible treasure. When they came ashore at Lindisfarne, the monks had no idea what was happening until it was over. The contemporary account in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle captures the quality of the shock. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The terror was not just about what had happened. It was about the implication, if Lindisfarne could fall, if the most sacred, most remote, most symbolically protected place in the Christian north of England could simply be walked into by men from the sea, then nothing was safe, and nothing was. Over the following century, the Norse range expanded with a speed and consistency that the targets of their attention found impossible to comprehend. They raided Ireland, they raided Scotland, they raided France, not just the coast but up the Seine to Paraphus twice, the second time requiring the French to pay a ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver to make them leave. They raided Spain. They raided the Mediterranean. They raided the coast of North Africa. They established settlements in Iceland and Greenland. They served as elite bodyguards to the emperors of Constantinople, the Varangian Guard, the most prestigious military unit in the Byzantine world, staffed by men from the Norwegian fjords. Let that geography sink in for a moment. From their home bases in Scandinavia, Norse warriors reached, not just sailed to, but raided, traded with, settled in, and in many cases extracted political tribute from territories spanning from the eastern coast of North America in the west to the Caspian Sea in the east, from the Arctic Circle in the north to the Mediterranean coastline of North Africa in the south. This is a range of operation that in the 9th and 10th centuries, no other single cultural group came close to matching. And they managed it with ships. The Norse longship is one of the most remarkable technological achievements in the history of human transportation. Not because it was technologically complex in any abstract sense. The metallurgy was sophisticated but not exceptional by 9th century standards. The wood sourced from the vast forests of Scandinavia, the tools used to shape it familiar across Northern Europe. What made it extraordinary was the integration of its design. The flexibility of the hull that allowed it to absorb the energy of North Atlantic, swells without breaking, the shallow draft that let it navigate rivers and beaches that deeper vessels could not approach, the symmetry of bow and stern that let it reverse direction instantly without turning, and the combination of sail and oar power that made it effective across every wind condition, from dead calm to full storm. A longship could cross the North Atlantic. It could also go up a river to the gates of Paris. It could be dragged overland between river systems. It could be beached on a sand flat and used as a fortified platform. Its crew could sleep under it during a rainstorm. It drew so little water that it could operate in conditions where defenders had assumed the sea itself would protect them. This was the primary strategic asset of the Norse world, and they used it with a tactical sophistication that their targets consistently underestimated until it was too late. The speed of Norse raids, the ability to strike, extract, and disappear before any organized military response could be mounted, was not luck. It was the product of ship design that gave them a mobility advantage so overwhelming that for the first century of the Viking Age, no land-based defensive system in Europe could effectively counter it. But ships were not the only Norse advantage. The Norse were, by the standards of their time and in specific tactical contexts, exceptional fighters. Not because they were braver than other people. The romantic mythology of berserk warriors who felt no pain and feared no death is mostly exactly that, mythology, though there are genuinely documented cases of what appear to be pharmacologically or psychologically altered combat states among certain Norse warriors. What made Norse warriors effective was less individual ferocity than collective discipline and the specific advantages conferred by their equipment. The Norse were early adopters of high-quality iron weaponry, at a time when iron was not uniformly distributed across their target populations. A Norse axe or sword in the 9th century was a genuinely superior weapon to many of the alternatives available to the people it was used against. Not necessarily in terms of the metallurgy, which varied considerably, but in terms of the scale and consistency of Norse weapons production and the cultural investment in weapons training that Norse society represented. Norse boys grew up with weapons. Their mythology was saturated with weapons. Their most prestigious social identities were organized around weapons. The Eddic poetry, the skaldic tradition, the very structure of their religious framework, all of it oriented around the figure of the warrior as the highest human type, the death in battle as the best death, the hall of slain warriors as the best afterlife. This was not decoration. It was a cultural operating system that produced generation after generation. Men who had been training with weapons since childhood and who understood interpersonal violence as the central, organizing activity of meaningful human life. Against most of the populations they encountered, farming communities in England and Ireland, monastic settlements in Scotland, trading towns in France. This combination of technological advantage, mobility, and cultural investment in violence produced results that were close to overwhelming. But there was a pattern in Norse expansion that becomes visible only when you look at the full geographic picture. The Norse expanded in every direction where they had a meaningful advantage. They raided the poorly defended coasts of the British Isles. They settled Iceland, which was essentially empty. They established footholds in Normandy through negotiation and then assimilation. They served as mercenaries in Byzantine service, trading their military skills for gold and prestige. They traded along the river systems of what is now Russia, founding settlements that would eventually grow into cities. And in every case, every single case, where they encountered organized military resistance that matched or exceeded their tactical capabilities, they adjusted their behavior. The Norse who settled Normandy did not do so because they conquered it. They did so because the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, offered them land, title, and a daughter in marriage. And because the Norse were pragmatic enough to take a good deal when they saw one. The Norse who served in the Varangian Guard were not conquerors. They were hired help. The Norse who traded along the Volga were not colonizers in any imperial sense. They were merchants. The myth of Norse invincibility was real enough to terrify an entire civilization. But it was always a myth, a useful one, enthusiastically promoted by the Norse themselves through a culture that understood the value of reputation as a strategic asset. The actual Norse were not invincible. They were adaptable, innovative, and exceptionally good at identifying and exploiting specific types of vulnerability, which makes what happened in Vinland all the more remarkable. Because in North America, for the first and only time in the entire history of the Viking Age, the Norse encountered a situation they could not adapt to, a vulnerability they could not exploit. an enemy. And here the word enemy must be used carefully, because the people the Norse called Skrælings had no particular reason to consider themselves anyone's enemy until the Norse showed up, who had a combination of advantages so complete that the Norse, for all their skill and all their centuries of accumulated maritime and military experience, simply could not overcome. And the most important of those advantages was not the number of warriors. It was not the specific weapons. It was not any single tactical innovation. It was 10,000 years of knowing exactly where they were. The Norse arrival in North America was not a single dramatic event. It was the end product of a process of incremental westward expansion that had been underway for more than a century, driven by a combination of ecological pressure, political instability in Scandinavia itself, and the extraordinary Norse capacity for navigating bodies of water that everyone else assumed were uncrossable. It begins as so much of Norse westward expansion begins, with Iceland. Iceland was settled by Norse colonists in the late 9th century, the traditional date given in the Landnámabók, the medieval Icelandic Book of Settlements, is 874 CE for the arrival of Ingolf Arnarsson, though archaeological evidence suggests Norse presence slightly earlier. The motivations were mixed. Some settlers were refugees from the political consolidation of Norway under Harald Fairhair, who preferred the freedom of an empty island to submission to a centralizing king. Others were simply opportunists who saw unclaimed land and took it. Others were the sons and daughters of settlers who needed new land because Iceland's own limited carrying capacity could not support indefinitely growing populations. Iceland turned out to be habitable, if not comfortable. Its interior was largely uninhabitable, volcanic, icy, without the forest cover that provided fuel and building material. But its coastal regions supported sheep, cattle, and fishing, and the Norse adapted to its specific ecological constraints with the same pragmatic intelligence they brought to every environment they colonized. From Iceland, the next step westward was not long in coming. Greenland was reached, or rather, reached again, since Irish monks appear to have visited it before the Norse, by Eiríkur Röði, Eric the Red, around 985 CE. Eric had been expelled from Iceland for manslaughter. This was not unusual in Norse society, which had formal legal processes for resolving interpersonal violence, one of which was temporary or permanent exile, and he used the enforced absence to explore the coastline that Icelandic sailors had glimpsed to the west. What he found was large, cold, mostly uninhabitable, and sitting on the edge of the North Atlantic, in a position that made the next step west almost inevitable for any sailor paying attention to the patterns of drift and weather. Eric brought settlers. A colony was established on Greenland's southwestern coast, and then, from Greenland, the continent that would eventually be called America became visible. The Norse sources give us two accounts of the discovery of North America, and both are complicated by the fact that they were written down several centuries after the events they describe, in a literary culture that made no sharp distinction between historical narrative and legendary embellishment. The Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red are the primary sources, and they agree on the broad outlines while diverging on the specific details in ways that have kept historians and archaeologists arguing productively for decades. The consensus supported now by archaeological evidence that did not exist when the sagas were first studied is roughly as follows. Around 1000 CE, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, led an expedition westward from Greenland and reached a landmass he called Vinland, the exact location of which has been debated for a century, though the settlement at Lansay Aws Meadows in northern Newfoundland is the only site in North America that has been archaeologically confirmed as Norse, and is generally accepted as the base camp for Norse exploration of the region. Leif's expedition did not, as far as the sources tell us, result in sustained contact with the indigenous inhabitants of the land. His people spent a winter and returned. But subsequent expeditions were more ambitious, and the contact they made was permanent, in the sense that it permanently altered Norse plans for North America. Thorfinn Karlsefni's expedition of approximately 1004 CE was the most ambitious Norse attempt to colonize Vinland. The sources tell us he brought approximately 160 people, a substantial number for a Norse colonial venture, including women, livestock, and the kinds of supplies and equipment that indicated a settlement rather than a raid. He was planning to stay. The land itself, by the account of the sagas, was extraordinary. The Norse found a coastline of dense forest, unlike anything in Iceland or Greenland, hardwood and softwood in abundance, the kind of timber that was already growing scarce in Scandinavia itself, and that Norse shipbuilding and construction required in enormous quantities. They found rivers full of salmon. They found grapes or berries. The identity of the plant that gave Vinland its name has been debated extensively, with wild grapes, gooseberries, and various other candidates proposed in quantities that seemed miraculous to people from the north. They found pasture land capable of supporting their cattle without supplemental winter feeding, something that was not possible in Greenland and barely possible in Iceland. By every material measure, Vinland was a better place to live than anywhere the Norse had yet colonized. And it was not empty. The first signs of the indigenous inhabitants, the people the Norse would call Skrælings, a word whose exact meaning is debated, but that is generally translated as something between wretches and weaklings, or perhaps simply barbarians, revealing the Norse assumption that whatever they were about to encounter was, by definition, inferior to themselves, appeared before actual contact was made. The sagas describe the Norse finding signs of habitation, crude shelters, fire pits, the remains of a camp that had recently been occupied, signs that people were watching them. Signs that the watchers were not making themselves visible. This should have been a warning, not because it indicated hostility. In itself, it indicated nothing more than reasonable caution on the part of people who had every reason to be cautious about a group of armed strangers who had just appeared on their coastline without warning. But because it indicated that the land was not empty, that the people in it knew how to move without being seen, and that they were already, from the first moment of Norse arrival, controlling the terms of the encounter. They knew where they were, they knew the terrain, they knew the season, the weather patterns, the routes through the forest, the behavior of every animal and plant in their environment. They had been living in and with this landscape for generations, for hundreds of generations, in fact, stretching back in an unbroken line to the first human inhabitants of the continent after the last ice age. The Norse were explorers, the Skrælings were home. That asymmetry would define everything that followed. The initial period of the Karlsefni expedition appears, from the saga accounts, to have been a period of cautious reconnaissance on both sides. The Norse were establishing their settlement. The archaeological evidence at Lance O's Meadows gives us a clear picture of what a Norse base camp in Vinland looked like. Turf buildings of the Greenlandic type, a smithy, a carpentry workshop, evidence of iron smelting. They were, in other words, doing what Norse colonists always did, replicating their material culture in a new landscape, transforming territory into something recognizable as home. The Skrælings were watching. We do not know what they made of the Norse. We have no Skræling accounts. Not because the indigenous people of northeastern North America did not have rich oral traditions, because they absolutely did, but because those traditions were not recorded in forms that survived to the modern period in ways that can be definitively connected to the specific events at Vinland. What we have is the Norse perspective, filtered through a literary tradition that was written down centuries later. And it is a perspective that tells us far more about Norse assumptions than about Skræling reality. But we can infer, we can use what we know about the cultures of northeastern North America in the relevant period, and we know a considerable amount through both archaeology and the ethnographic records of later contact, to construct a picture of what the Norse arrival looked like from the other side. What the Skrælings saw, emerging from the sea, was a group of large men with light skin and hair colors they had not encountered before, carrying weapons of a material, iron, whose properties were unlike anything in their experience. The Norse longship was unlike any vessel they knew. The Norse cattle and Norse dogs were unlike any animals in their world. The Norse were loud and purposeful, and they moved with the confidence of people who did not know they should be careful. Any experienced person, looking at a group of armed strangers who had just appeared uninvited on their territory, would do exactly what the Skrælings did. They would wait, they would watch, they would gather information, and then they would make a decision. The first direct contact between Norse and Skrælings, as described in the saga sources, is a scene of almost theatrical tension. A moment in which two completely different civilizational frameworks attempt to find common ground across a gap so wide that neither side had the conceptual tools to bridge it. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, the first Skrælings to approach the Norse settlement came in skin boats, kayak-like vessels that the Norse found deeply strange. Unlike anything in their maritime experience, there were many of them. They waved sticks that made a noise the Norse describes as going around with the sun. which has been interpreted as a rattle or a stick being spun in a particular direction, and which most scholars read as a gesture of peaceful intent, a greeting or signal that the approaching party was not immediately hostile. The Norse, to their credit, did not immediately attack. Instead, they attempted trade. The sagas describe the Norse offering red cloth, a luxury trade good that had proven effective in establishing initial commercial relationships with indigenous peoples in other contexts of Norse exploration. In exchange for furs, the exchange worked at first. The Skrælings accepted the cloth and offered furs in return. By the standards of their respective economic systems, both sides appear to have considered this a satisfactory transaction. What happened next is where the fatal errors begin. The Norse, emboldened by successful initial trade and operating within a social framework in which visible displays of force were a normal and expected part of commercial negotiation, allowed one of their bulls, a large, aggressively behaved domestic cattle animal, something the Skrælings had never seen, to run loose from the settlement. The Skrælings, who had no reference point for this animal, and who understood the appearance of a large, aggressive, charging animal in the only terms available to them as a predatory threat, fled. They did not return for 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which the Norse apparently did not register that they had just demonstrated to the entire surrounding indigenous population that they possessed something that caused people who had lived in this landscape for generations to run in terror. They could have used that time to think about what the Skrælings' flight meant, about what kind of prior experience with large dangerous animals would produce that reaction, about how many people had seen it happen and what they were telling others about what they had seen. Instead, the Norse continued building their settlement and waiting for the Skrælings to come back. When they did come back, they came in force. The saga accounts describe a large fleet of skin boats arriving at the Norse settlement, many more than the initial group. This time there was no rattling of sticks in peaceful greeting. This time the Skrælings were making a different kind of noise and approaching in a different kind of way. And the Norse suddenly found themselves trying to process a military situation for which their entire previous experience had not prepared them. Because the Skrælings were not fighting the way anything was supposed to fight. Norse military tactics in this period were built around a set of core assumptions that had proven reliable across every conflict they had ever engaged in. You close with the enemy. You bring your shields together. You use the superior reach and impact of your iron weapons to overwhelm an opponent who is, in most cases, less well-armed and less well-trained. You maintain formation discipline. You break the enemy's formation, and then you pursue. None of these assumptions applied. The Skrælings did not form up. They did not seek to close with the Norse in a way that would allow Norse weapons their maximum effectiveness. They moved fluidly in small groups, using terrain that they knew, and the Norse did not, the shoreline, the forest margin, the water itself, to control the geometry of the engagement in ways that kept the Norse from bringing their advantages to bear. They attacked from a distance, with weapons that the Norse had no comparable equivalent to, bows that were smaller and in some accounts faster than what the Norse knew from Europe, and something else. Something that the sagas describe in terms of considerable alarm, and something approaching incomprehension. The sagas describe the Skrælings using what is called in Old Norse a völur, or ball, large projectiles, possibly shot from poles or catapults of some kind, that were described as blue-black in color and the size of a sheep's stomach. The exact nature of these weapons has been debated for a very long time. Some scholars think they were water-filled bladders used to create noise and psychological disruption. Some think they were inflatable bags. Some think the saga accounts represent a genuine memory of a type of projectile weapon, possibly a bola, a weighted throwing implement common among northern peoples that the Norse had never encountered and could not categorize within their existing weapons taxonomy. Whatever they were, their effect on Norse morale was dramatic. Here is a truth about combat that military historians understand, but that popular accounts of ancient warfare consistently understate. The psychological dimension of military confrontation is not secondary to the physical dimension. It is co-equal. An army that is physically capable of fighting, but psychologically unable to maintain cohesion, is an army that loses, regardless of the quality of its weapons or the skill of its individual fighters. Fear, real, physical, uncontrollable fear of the kind that is produced by genuinely unfamiliar and unpredictable stimuli, is a force multiplier, and it operates in both directions. The Norse were afraid not of losing, not even necessarily of dying. The Norse relationship with death in battle was genuinely different from modern attitudes, shaped by a religious framework that explicitly valorized death in combat as the best possible end for a warrior. What they were afraid of was something more fundamental. They did not understand what was happening to them. They were in a landscape they did not know, surrounded by enemies whose numbers they could not estimate because those enemies moved through terrain that concealed them, being attacked with weapons. They had no framework for categorizing, and they had no idea how many more enemies were waiting in the forest they could see but could not enter on advantageous terms. The saga accounts describe a moment of near collapse. The Norse were on the edge of routing, of the kind of sudden, complete psychological breakdown that turns a fighting force into a mob of running individuals who are individually much more vulnerable than they were when organized. The sagas tell us that a woman, Freydis Eiríksdóttir, the illegitimate daughter of Eric the Red, one of the most remarkable figures in all of Norse history, stepped in at this moment in a way that stopped the rout. Freydis, heavily pregnant by some accounts, came out of the Norse settlement and did something that is extraordinary, regardless of which version of the story you believe. In one version, she grabbed a sword from a fallen warrior and slapped it against her exposed breast, screaming defiance at the Skrælings. In another version, she simply stood her ground with a sword when all the men around her were fleeing. In both versions, the effect was the same. The sight of a woman standing and fighting when trained warriors were running shamed enough of the Norse fighters back into something resembling a fighting posture that the immediate crisis passed. The Skrælings withdrew, not because they were defeated, not because their attack had failed. They withdrew, the sagas suggest, because they had achieved their tactical objective, which appears to have been demonstrating to these strange pale-skinned invaders from the sea that the land was defended, that its defenders would not be easily overwhelmed, and that the cost of remaining would continue to rise. It was a message the Norse received. What followed was not a decisive battle. There is no single engagement in the Norse-Skræling conflict that ended Norse ambitions in North America. What there was instead was something more like a slow-motion psychological dismantling, a progressive realization on the part of the Norse that the situation they had sailed into was one that their usual toolkit was inadequate to resolve. The Norse could not effectively pursue the Skrælings. They could not bring the Skrælings to open battle on terms that favored Norse weapons and tactics. They could not protect their settlement from raids by people who knew every approach route through terrain the Norse were still learning to navigate. They could not communicate effectively enough to negotiate. And in any case, by the time the violence had started, the window for negotiation had already closed. And underneath all of this was a number problem that no amount of Norse tactical skill could solve. The Norse expedition to Vinland numbered at most a few hundred people. The indigenous population of northeastern North America in the early 11th century, the various Algonquian-speaking peoples of the region, the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq, the Beothuk, the peoples of the Maritimes and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, numbered in the tens of thousands, possibly much more. These were not scattered, isolated bands of hunter-gatherers, operating in isolation from one another. They were complex societies with extensive communication and trade networks spanning enormous distances, with political structures capable of organizing collective responses to external threats, and with the accumulated environmental knowledge of a continent that the Norse were encountering for the first time. The Norse, for all their military skill, were a tiny, isolated group of people in a landscape controlled by tens of thousands of others who had every advantage except iron. And as the Norse would eventually come to understand, too late, iron, in a forest warfare context against an enemy who would not stand still long enough to be hit with it, was not the decisive advantage it appeared. There is a particular kind of fear that military historians call strategic anxiety, the fear not of the enemy you can see and engage, but of the enemy you cannot see and do not understand. It is qualitatively different from the fear of a visible threat, and it is in many ways more debilitating, because it cannot be resolved by courage or skill or the application of superior force. It can only be resolved by information, by understanding, by developing enough knowledge of the enemy's capabilities and intentions to model their behavior reliably enough to counter it. The Norse in Vinland suffered from strategic anxiety in its most acute possible form. They did not know how many Skrælings there were. They did not know where they were at any given moment. They did not know what they wanted. They did not know how they communicated or made collective decisions or organized their military actions. They did not know whether the attacks they had experienced were the maximum the Skrælings were capable of, or a preliminary demonstration before something much larger. They did not know whether the forest immediately around their settlement contained 50 Skrælings or 5,000. They could not find out. Their scouting capabilities in this terrain were severely limited. The Norse were expert sailors and expert navigators of open water, but they were not forest fighters. The dense mixed woodland of northeastern North America, spruce and fir and birch and maple, grown thick enough in places to reduce visibility to a few tens of meters, crisscrossed with waterways, and wetlands and terrain features that the Norse had no mental map of, was not an environment in which Norse tactical skills translated effectively. The Skrælings, by contrast, were operating in their backyard. They knew every trail. They knew every crossing. They knew which areas flooded, in which seasons, which routes passable in winter, and which were not, where the food sources were, and when they would be available, where the high ground was that gave observation of the surrounding landscape, where the dense cover was that allowed approach without detection. They also understood something about the Norse that the Norse did not yet understand about themselves. The Norse were isolated. They had no reinforcement available within any time frame that mattered. Their supply lines ran 3,000 miles back to Greenland. Every man or woman they lost was permanently lost. Every Skræling who withdrew into the forest was absorbed into a population that could absorb the loss and continue. The mathematics of the situation were simple, and the Skrælings, whatever word they would have used, in whatever language, to describe their understanding of the situation, appear to have grasped them clearly. The Norse experience of Skræling warfare was, by the evidence of the sagas, and by what we can infer from later ethnographic accounts of the military practices of northeastern North American peoples, an experience of profound psychological disruption. This disruption operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most immediate level, there was the unfamiliarity of the weapons and tactics. We have already discussed the strange projectiles that alarmed the Norse, but there were other elements. The use of sound as a weapon, the deliberate generation of noise designed to disorient and terrify, is documented in various forms across indigenous North American military practice. War cries, drums, specific sonic patterns designed to produce fear responses in opponents who had not been conditioned to resist them. These were tools that the peoples of northeastern North America used with sophistication, and the Norse had no prior experience of them. At a deeper level, there was the problem of the forest itself. The Norse came from a world in which the sea was the domain of freedom and power, and the land, even wild, forested land, was terrain that men could move through and control. But the forests of northeastern North America were not like the forests of Scandinavia, which were heavily harvested, crossed by roads and trails, worn deep by centuries of use, penetrated by the clearings and farms and settlements that represented Norse land use. The Vinland forest was old growth of a density and scale that had no Scandinavian equivalent, and moving through it required skills and knowledge that take lifetimes to acquire. Every time a Norse party entered the forest, They were on ground where the Skrælings held every advantage. They could be watched without being seen. They could be led into terrain that disadvantaged them and then ambushed. They could be separated from the group and individually eliminated. The forest, for the Norse, was not terrain they could fight in. It was terrain that could be used against them. And then there was the deepest level of the psychological disruption, the theological one. The Norse world was saturated with the supernatural, the Norse religious framework, the complex, layered mythology of the Eddic tradition, with its gods and giants and spirits and fate beings, and the constant interpenetration of the human and non-human worlds was not a background belief system that operated separately from everyday life. It was the interpretive framework through which the Norse understood everything that happened to them, including and especially things that were frightening and inexplicable. When the Norse encountered phenomena they could not explain, phenomena that seemed to violate the expected rules of the world, their first interpretive move was to reach for the supernatural. This was not stupidity or credulity. It was the natural operation of a worldview in which the supernatural was real, present, and continuously active in human affairs. The Skrælings in Vinland produced phenomena the Norse could not explain. Their ability to appear and disappear in the forest without warning. The strange weapons that made no sense within the Norse weapons taxonomy. The sounds that came from the tree line at night. And it is documented across many cultures' accounts of forest warfare against indigenous peoples that the deliberate use of sound in darkness was a standard tactic for producing psychological disruption in enemies who had no reference framework for what they were hearing. The sheer number of them emerging from a landscape that seemed, from the Norse perspective, too wild and too empty to support large populations. All of this fed into a growing Norse conviction that the Skrælings were not entirely human, not in the sense that the Norse denied their physical reality. They were manifestly physically present, but in the sense that they seemed to operate according to rules that did not apply to ordinary human beings. Rules that might apply to the various categories of supernatural beings that populated the Norse imaginative world. The Landvætti, the spirits of specific places, the trolls and Jötnar of the wilderness, the beings that lived at the margins of the inhabited world and that were neither god nor human nor animal, but something that slipped between categories. This interpretation, once made, would have had a specific and predictable effect on Norse morale, because the Norse theological framework, for all its sophistication, had a specific vulnerability. It did not have a very good answer to the question of how you fight effectively against supernatural beings in their own domain. The Eddic tradition was full of stories of humans encountering such beings, and the stories did not consistently end well for the humans. The most reliable human strategy in such situations was not confrontation but avoidance, leaving the territory of the being in question and not returning, which is exactly what the Norse eventually did. But before we get to the retreat, we need to understand something about the Skrælings that the Norse never understood, and that mainstream history has, until very recently, largely failed to understand as well. The people the Norse called Skrælings were not a single people. The term is used in the sagas to cover what were, in reality, multiple distinct cultural and linguistic groups with different histories, different social organizations, different relationships to the land, and different ways of life. The peoples of the subarctic regions, the ancestors of groups who would later be called by Europeans Inuit and Yup'ik, were different from the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the forested coastal regions, who were themselves internally diverse. The cultures of northeastern North America in the early 11th century were not a monolith. They were a mosaic of relationships, alliances, and distinct identities shaped by thousands of years of interaction with specific landscapes. What they shared across this diversity was the accumulated environmental knowledge of their respective territories. Knowledge that, in its totality, represented one of the most sophisticated bodies of practical science ever developed by human beings. They knew the weather, not just in the general sense that any experienced outdoors person knows weather, but in the specific granular sense that comes from generations of careful observation, passed down through oral traditions that functioned as living databases of ecological information. They knew which cloud formations preceded which wind conditions. They knew which plant behaviors indicated what was happening to the soil and water table. They knew the migration patterns of every animal they depended on, the behavioral quirks of individual species, the ways in which ecological conditions in one part of their territory affected conditions in another. They knew the water, the coastlines and river systems of northeastern North America were, for the peoples who lived there, not obstacles to movement, but highways, networks of interconnected waterways that allowed communication and travel across vast distances with a speed and ease that the Norse, who thought of themselves as the world's greatest sailors, would have found astonishing. The skin boats the Norse found so strange were not primitive craft. They were precisely engineered for the specific conditions of the waters they operated in, more maneuverable in surf, more stable in wind chop, more easily portaged across land than the Norse longship, and they knew each other. This is perhaps the most important point. The indigenous peoples of northeastern North America were not isolated groups, cut off from each other by the vastness of the continent. They maintained extensive networks of trade, alliance, information exchange, and social connection that spanned enormous distances. News of the Norse arrival, strange pale people with metal weapons coming from the sea, would not have stayed localized to the immediate area around Lance Oz Meadows. It would have traveled along those networks with a speed that might well have surprised the Norse, had they been aware of it. By the time the Norse were well established at their settlement, the news of their presence had already propagated through the indigenous communication networks of the region. People who had not yet seen a Norse ship knew they existed. People who had not yet encountered a Norse axe knew what they could do. The collective intelligence of the Skræling world was processing the Norse arrival with a thoroughness that no individual Norse scout or expedition could hope to match. This is why the numbers mattered so much more than the Norse could understand. It was not simply that the Skrælings had more fighters. It was that they had more information, more environmental knowledge, more social infrastructure, and more time, because they were not going anywhere. And the Norse, as their situation became progressively less tenable, were running out of options. The Norse failure in Vinland was not caused solely by the external pressure of Skræling resistance, devastating as that pressure was. It was also, in a manner that the sagas document with uncomfortable honesty, the product of a catastrophic failure of internal cohesion among the Norse themselves. To understand this dimension of the story, we need to return to Freydis Eiríksdóttir. Freydis appears in both major saga accounts of Vinland, and in both accounts she is a figure of extraordinary force and moral complexity. In the saga of the Greenlanders, she is presented first as a hero, the woman who stood her ground when the Norse warriors fled from the Skrælings, whose defiant gesture reversed a route that might otherwise have ended the entire expedition in a single disastrous engagement. And then, in the same saga, she is presented as a villain of almost shocking viciousness. The account in the saga of the Greenlanders describes Freydis organizing a joint expedition to Vinland with two Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, in a formal partnership that divided the enterprise into equal shares and guaranteed mutual support. What followed, according to the saga, was a deliberate, systematic betrayal that ended in mass murder. Freydis, by the saga account, engineered a series of provocations and false accusations that poisoned the relationship between her own people and the Icelanders, eventually convincing her husband, Thorvarður, to kill the Icelandic men in their sleep. When Thorvarður and his men balked at killing the Icelandic women, possibly because killing women violated a fundamental taboo in Norse social code, Freydis reportedly killed them herself with an axe. The saga Odysseus, threatening death to anyone who reported what had happened in Vinland, and the survivors returning to Greenland in silence. The truth eventually emerging only after Leif Erikson tortured 3 members of the expedition to extract it. This account is almost certainly not straightforward historical reporting. It has the quality of a cautionary tale, with narrative elements that feel shaped by the moral frameworks of the 13th century when it was written down, rather than the early 11th century when it supposedly occurred. But its core content, that the Norse expeditions to Vinland were torn apart by internal conflicts that made sustained settlement impossible, regardless of the Skræling threat, is very likely true in its broad outlines, because this was the other great vulnerability of the Norse colonial enterprise in Vinland. Norse society was intensely competitive and intensely individualistic in ways that produced spectacular individual achievement and consistently disastrous collective coordination. The same cultural framework that made Norse warriors brave, innovative, and effective in the short-term contexts of raiding and trading. The emphasis on personal honor, the valorization of individual, martial achievement, the complex web of obligations and insults and blood feuds that structured Norse social life. became a liability in the sustained collect effort required to establish and maintain a settlement in a hostile environment thousands of miles from any support. Every expedition to Vinland that the sagas describe was plagued by exactly this problem. Men competed for precedence. Arguments over resource allocation, over who got which territory, which trade goods, which share of the available wealth became violent. Personal insults in a society where personal honor was a survival resource generated feuds that consumed the collective energy the expedition needed to survive the Skrælings threat. The Skrælings did not need to destroy the Norse in open battle. They just needed to keep the pressure high enough and consistently enough that the Norse could not afford the luxury of fighting each other. It was a strategy that worked, whether or not it was consciously deployed. The Norse were also, by the time of their final withdrawal, suffering from a very specific kind of institutional failure that the sagas do not quite name, but that is visible between the lines of their accounts. They had run out of stories to tell about what they were doing. This sounds abstract, but it is not. Norse culture was a narrative culture in the deepest sense, a culture in which the meaning of actions was inseparable from the stories told about those actions, in which the worth of a life was measured by whether it generated a saga worth telling, in which the highest compliment was to be the subject of skaldic verse, and the deepest shame was to die without your deeds being remembered. The stories the Norse could tell about Vinland were not good stories. They were not stories of glorious conquest. They were not stories of a hero meeting worthy opponents and triumphing against the odds. They were stories of confusion, of retreating before people they had dismissed as weaklings, of internal conflict and betrayal, of a landscape that had defeated them, not through any single dramatic reversal, but through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of disadvantages that they could not overcome. Norse culture had a word for dying in your bed in old age without having achieved anything notable, Stroud death. It was considered among the worst possible ends, an end that left you unable to enter Valhalla, forever excluded from the company of the honored dead. The Norse in Vinland were not dying straw deaths, but they were, in a sense, living them, engaged in an enterprise that generated no glory, no conquest, no saga-worthy deeds of valor, only an increasingly desperate holding action against a force that would not fight them on terms they could understand. The decision to leave Vinland permanently was not, in the end, the result of a single defeat or a single decision by a single leader. It was the result of a collective recognition, arriving at different times for different people, expressed in different ways, but converging on the same conclusion that the cost of staying exceeded any possible benefit, that the Skrælings resistance was not going to diminish with time, that the internal conflicts within the Norse community were consuming resources they could not afford, and that Vinland, for all its material abundance, was a place where Norse civilization could not take root. They did not frame it that way, because that framing would have been too painful. They framed it in the sagas as a rational calculation. Too few men to hold the territory against too many Skrælings. This was true as far as it went. but it understated the depth of the failure by reducing it to arithmetic. The real failure was not numerical, it was civilizational. The Norse were operating within a set of assumptions about how the world worked, how other people worked, what power looked like, and where it came from. And every single one of those assumptions was wrong in the context of Vinland. Wrong not in the sense of being morally inferior, but wrong in the specific practical sense that they did not produce the outcomes the Norse were aiming for. And the Norse, for all their adaptability in other contexts, could not adapt fast enough or completely enough to matter. The story that the sagas tell is compelling. It is also, by its nature, partial, shaped by the literary conventions of the culture that produced it, colored by the passage of 2 or more centuries between events and their recording, filtered through the perspectives of people who were not there and who were working from oral traditions that had themselves been shaped by the competing interests of the families and communities whose ancestors the sagas described. What archaeology has given us over the past 60 years is a corrective to the sagas that is simultaneously more limited and more certain. More limited because the physical evidence of Norse presence in North America is necessarily fragmentary, the product of a settlement that lasted only a few years, that was abandoned deliberately in a manner that probably involved removing portable valuables and leaving behind only what was too heavy or too unimportant to carry, and that then sat undiscovered for close to a millennium. More certain because physical evidence does not have agendas. A piece of iron slag in a bog in Newfoundland is either Norse or it is not, and the methods available to modern archaeology can, with a high degree of confidence, distinguish the two. The site at Los Osa Meadows at the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland was identified in 1960 by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and the archaeologist Anne Steen Ingstad after a search of the northeastern North American coastline, guided by the geographic descriptions in the sagas. What they found and what subsequent decades of excavation by archaeologists from multiple countries have confirmed and expanded is the only unambiguously Norse archaeological site in North America, a settlement of turf buildings whose construction method, spatial organization, and associated artifacts are definitively Norse in character. The site contains the remains of 8 buildings, 3 large dwelling structures of the Greenlandic longhouse type, a smithy. The presence of a smithy is particularly significant because iron smelting requires a specific set of associated technologies, skills, and raw materials that are diagnostic of Norse or early medieval European presence in a way that simpler artifacts are not. A carpentry workshop, a boat repair facility, the remains of a forge with iron slag and a Norse-type stone anvil. The radiocarbon dates cluster around 1000 CE, consistent with the saga accounts of Leif Erikson's expedition. What the site tells us about the scale and duration of Norse presence in North America is illuminating. The dwelling structures could have housed between 70 and 90 people, consistent with a large expedition, but not a permanent colony. The lack of evidence of agricultural activity is significant. The Norse brought no plows, planted no fields, made no modifications to the surrounding landscape of the kind that would indicate they were planning to stay for generations. The material culture is that of a temporary base camp, not a permanent settlement. The smithy is particularly interesting from the perspective of the Norse-Skræling relationship. Iron, the manufacture of iron from raw ore, the ability to create tools and weapons of iron, was one of the most significant technological differences between the Norse and the indigenous peoples of northeastern North America. The Skrælings had copper tools and weapons in some regions, and they worked bone and stone and wood with extraordinary skill, but they did not smelt iron. The Norse could, and yet iron did not save them. This is a point worth dwelling on, because it cuts against one of the most persistent assumptions in popular historical thinking about the relationship between European technology and indigenous peoples in the Americas. The story that is usually told, the story of Hernán Cortés, of Francisco Pizarro, of the subsequent European colonization of the Americas, is, in large part, a story in which technological advantage translates into relatively rapid military dominance. The Norse-Skræling encounter does not fit that story. Iron weapons, in the context of forest warfare against opponents who knew the terrain and who chose to engage on their own terms, were not decisively superior to the weapons available to the Skrælings. An axe or sword is devastatingly effective against an opponent who will stand still long enough to be hit with it. It is much less effective against opponents who engage at range with projectile weapons, who use terrain and mobility to avoid the kind of close engagement where iron weapons are maximally effective, and who can, when pressed, simply withdraw into landscape that the axe wielder cannot pursue them through effectively. The Norse at Lance aux Meadows were, in the relevant tactical context, not overwhelmingly superior to the Skrælings. They were differently equipped, with specific advantages in specific contexts and specific disadvantages in others, and the Skrælings, with their intimate knowledge of the terrain and their ability to choose when and how to engage, had the option of fighting in the contexts where Norse advantages were minimized and Skræling advantages were maximized. What the archaeology also gives us is evidence of the Skrælings themselves, not at Lance aux Meadows, which appears to have been unoccupied by indigenous people at the time of Norse settlement, but at surrounding sites that establish the presence and sophistication of the indigenous cultures of northeastern Newfoundland and Labrador in the relevant period. The maritime archaic people, who had occupied the region for thousands of years before the Norse arrived, had developed technologies and social organizations of considerable sophistication. Their successors and contemporaries in the region, the ancestors of the Beothuk people of Newfoundland, the various Algonquian groups of the Labrador coast, were part of the broader world of northeastern North American indigenous cultures that the Norse were encountering. The Dorset culture, sometimes called the Paleo-Eskimo tradition, had occupied large portions of the Arctic and subarctic regions of North America for thousands of years before the Norse arrived, and was in the process of being displaced or absorbed by the expanding Thule culture, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, in exactly the period when the Norse were active in Vinland. The relationship between these cultural transitions and the Norse presence in the region is an area of active archaeological research. What emerges from the archaeology taken as a whole is a picture of northeastern North America at 1000 CE that is emphatically not the empty, underpopulated wilderness that later European colonizers sometimes imagined, and that popular culture has sometimes assumed. It was a landscape fully inhabited by culturally sophisticated peoples with established social structures, extensive communication networks, and deep knowledge of their environment. Peoples who were entirely capable of organizing effective resistance to a small, isolated group of foreign invaders who had appeared without warning on their coastline. The Norse were not encountering a tabula rasa. They were encountering the outcome of 10,000 years of human adaptation to a specific environment, an adaptation so complete, so sophisticated, and so thoroughly integrated into every aspect of Skrælings life that it represented, in practice, an insurmountable home field advantage. And there is one more piece of evidence that the archaeology has given us, evidence that arrives not from excavation, but from the analysis of ancient DNA. In 2021, a study published in the journal Nature analyzed DNA from human remains and archaeological samples associated with indigenous North American populations and found genetic evidence of contact between Norse and indigenous North American peoples. Specifically, evidence of a small amount of European genetic material in populations descended from groups that occupied the region of Newfoundland and Labrador. This is not conclusive evidence of sustained contact or intermarriage. The signal is small, and the interpretation of ancient DNA in contact situations is always complex, but it is consistent with the saga accounts of Norse-Skrælings interaction that went beyond simple hostility, accounts of trade, of captives taken on both sides, of a relationship that was, however, brief and however fraught, a genuine encounter between two human populations. The people are real, the contact was real, and the outcome was real. The Norse left, the Skrælings stayed. There is a question that lurks beneath every account of the Norse encounter with the Skrælings, and it is a question that historians and archaeologists have never quite answered to full satisfaction. Why did no one come back? The Norse knew North America existed. They had been there. They had settlements, even if temporary, in a land that by every material measure offered more than any territory they had previously colonized. They knew where it was. The navigation routes from Greenland were not complicated, and Norse sailors were among the most skilled navigators in the world. The Greenland colony continued to exist and to be in contact with Iceland and Norway for centuries after the Vinland expeditions. And yet, there are no records of any subsequent Norse attempt to colonize or even systematically explore North America. The continent that would eventually be called America sits in the collective Norse memory of the period like a closed door, acknowledged as existing, acknowledged as having been reached, and then simply not returned to. Part of the answer is practical. The Norse Greenland colonies were themselves marginal enterprises perennially short of the population and resources that a serious North American colonial venture would have required. The political situation in Scandinavia, the increasing consolidation of power under centralized monarchies, the Christianization of the Norse world, which changed the social and institutional frameworks within which expeditions were organized, reduced the cultural capacity for the kind of adventurous, long-distance colonization that the early Viking Age had enabled. Climate also played a role. The medieval warm period, which had made the North Atlantic crossings relatively hospitable in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, began to reverse in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Norse Greenland colonies went from marginal to desperate as the climate cooled and the sea ice expanded. By the 15th century, the last Greenlandic Norse were gone, and with them the bridgehead from which any renewed North American venture would have had to launch. But there is another dimension to the silence that is less practical and more psychological. The Vinland expeditions were, by Norse cultural standards, failures. Not glorious failures of the kind that generate legends. Not the kind of failure that you could write a good skaldic poem about. Because the defeat was not the kind of defeat that could be reframed as valor. It was the defeat of withdrawal, of abandonment, of leaving a land that you claimed you had reached and could not hold. In a culture where reputation was everything and failure was something to be hidden or reframed at all costs, the Vinland experience was not a story that powerful people in the Norse world had strong incentives to amplify. The families whose ancestors had made the expeditions had reasons to tell the stories. The sagas preserved in Iceland were, in part, family histories, and the Vinland expeditions involved the family of Eric the Red, one of the most prominent families in the Greenlandic Norse world. But there was no political authority, no institutional power that had invested in Vinland and therefore had incentives to publicize what happened there. No king had sent the expeditions. No church had blessed them. No wealthy patron had financed them in a way that required a public accounting of the results. The Vinland expeditions existed at the margins of the Norse world's institutional memory, and at the margins is where they stayed. When European awareness of North America was rediscovered, Columbus in 1492, followed by the avalanche of exploration, conquest, and colonization that transformed the world in the 16th century. The Norse precedent was known to some scholars, but not taken seriously as a model or a warning. The Spanish and Portuguese, the British and the French, the Dutch and the Swedes who colonized North America in the 16th through 18th centuries had access to the Norse sagas in translation and in scholarly discussion. But they did not read in those sagas the specific warning that the encounter with the Skrælings contained. They read only the fact of prior European presence, confirmation that the continent was reachable, that it had been reached before, and not the lesson that reaching it and holding it were two entirely different things that required entirely different capabilities. The later European colonizations of North America were, of course, ultimately more successful than the Norse attempt. though successful is a word that requires enormous qualification, given what that success cost the indigenous peoples of the continent. But that later success depended on factors that were absent in 1004 CE. Disease, which spread ahead of the colonizers and killed indigenous populations at rates that would have been incomprehensible to anyone in the early medieval world. The institutional and financial backing of European nation-states with the resources to sustain colonial ventures through decades of difficulty, and, eventually, the willingness to engage in systematic violence at a scale that the Norse, whatever their reputation, had neither the numbers nor the organization to contemplate. The Norse Skrælings encounter was a different kind of event. It was a meeting between two groups that were, in the terms of the early 11th century, much more evenly matched than the later European indigenous encounters would be. The Norse had iron. The Skrælings had everything else. And in the specific context of Vinland, in the early 11th century, everything else was enough. The erasure of this story from mainstream's historical consciousness is not, in the end, the result of any single act of suppression or any coordinated effort to hide an uncomfortable truth. It is the result of the ordinary operation of historical attention. The tendency of later generations to focus on the encounters that shaped the world they inhabit, and to neglect the encounters whose outcome was a dead end, a withdrawal, a door that closed. The Norse went to North America. They met the people who lived there. The people who lived there sent them home. And then, for 500 years, the door was closed, until it was opened again from the outside by people who did not know or did not care that it had been tried before. We have spent most of this documentary talking about the Norse, their capabilities, their failures, their psychological experience of the Vinland encounter. This is partly because the Norse sources are the primary documentary evidence for the encounter, and partly because the story, as it is usually told, is a story about the Norse, about what they found and what they could not conquer. But the story has another center of gravity, and we have not yet examined it directly. Who were the people the Norse called Skrælings? Not as the Norse saw them, weaponized strangers in skin boats, adversaries to be feared and categorized in whatever terms the Norse framework allowed, but as they were, as the accumulated evidence of archaeology, linguistics, oral tradition, and modern science allows us to reconstruct them. The short answer is that the people the Norse encountered in North America were the heirs of the longest continuous human habitation of any continent outside Africa. Human beings have been in North America for at least 15,000 years, and possibly significantly longer. The exact date of initial peopling remains an area of active research and genuine scientific debate, with some evidence suggesting presence well before the last glacial maximum, and other evidence pointing to post-glacial migration along the coastal route, sometimes called the Kelp Highway. Whatever the date of initial arrival, by the time the Norse showed up at the turn of the first millennium CE, the indigenous peoples of northeastern North America had been in continuous occupation of their territories for a duration that makes the entire history of European civilization look like a recent development. And they had not spent that time standing still. The people of the maritime archaic tradition, who dominated the northeastern coasts of North America for thousands of years before the Norse arrived, had developed maritime technologies of extraordinary sophistication. Their boats, the ancestors of the skin boats that so alarmed the Norse, were engineered specifically for the waters they operated in, combining a lightness and maneuverability that Norse longships could not match in surf and shallow coastal environments, with a structural resilience that allowed them to operate in sea conditions that heavier wooden vessels could not safely navigate. Their hunting technology was equally sophisticated. The harpoon systems developed by the maritime peoples of northeastern North America for hunting large sea mammals, a technology refined over thousands of years of practical application, represented engineering solutions to specific problems that are, in their own terms, as impressive as any technology the Norse brought with them. The detachable harpoon head, the line system that allowed a hunter to maintain connection to a wounded animal without being dragged, the float systems that tired the prey and marked its location. These were not primitive tools. They were precision instruments developed through generations of careful observation and iterative improvement. On land, the peoples of the northeastern forests had developed an equally comprehensive body of knowledge and practice. Their understanding of the forest ecology was not simply a matter of knowing where the animals were. It was a sophisticated science of interrelationships, how the behavior of one species affected another, how seasonal changes propagated through the ecosystem, how human hunting pressure needed to be managed over time to prevent depletion of prey populations. This was not academic knowledge. It was survival knowledge, refined over thousands of years and encoded in cultural practices, rituals, taboos, social norms around resource use that functioned as management systems for the ecosystems they depended on. Their social structures were adapted to the specific demands of their environments in ways that produced, in different regions, different solutions to the fundamental problems of human organization. How do you maintain social cohesion across seasons and landscapes that require different group sizes and different movement patterns? How do you manage relationships with neighboring groups that are sometimes allies and sometimes competitors? How do you transmit knowledge across generations in a way that preserves its accuracy and its relevance to changing conditions? The answers that the peoples of northeastern North America had developed were not simple. They involved complex kinship systems, sophisticated protocols for intergroup interaction, oral traditions of extraordinary richness and precision, and social institutions, including the institution of specialist knowledge holders, whose role was the preservation and transmission of specific bodies of technical and cultural knowledge that had functional parallels to the institutions of other complex societies. These were not the wretches of the Norse word Skræling. They were sophisticated peoples who had been successfully managing complex environments for longer than recorded history, and who had developed through the same process of observation, trial, error, and cumulative learning that produces knowledge in every human culture. A body of practical and conceptual understanding of their world that was, in its own terms, equal to anything the Norse possessed in theirs. The asymmetry between Norse and Skrailing was real in specific technological domains, in the specific context of the Vinland encounter, but it was not the asymmetry that the Norse assumed, and not the asymmetry that later historical narratives have sometimes implied. The Norse had iron. The Skrælings had everything else that mattered in that time and that place. And the most important thing they had was something that cannot be easily measured, but that the Norse-Skrailing encounter demonstrates with crystalline clarity. They had belonging. They belonged to that landscape in the deepest possible sense. Not as a legal or political claim, but as an ecological and cultural reality. Every feature of that landscape was known to them, named by them, integrated into their practical and symbolic understanding of the world. The forests, the coastlines, the rivers, the weather patterns, the animal populations, the seasonal rhythms. All of it was part of a comprehensive framework of understanding that had been built, piece by piece, over 10,000 years of human life in that specific place. The Norse were strangers in that landscape. They would have been strangers there for years, for decades. Possibly, if they had stayed, for generations. Before they could have developed anything approaching the depth of environmental knowledge the Skrælings already possessed. They did not stay long enough to find out. The withdrawal from Vinland was not a single dramatic event. It was, like so much of the Norse experience since their fair, a process, gradual, undramatic by the standards of the sagas, and ultimately complete. The saga accounts describe the final stages of the Vinland enterprise as a period of deepening crisis in which the cumulative effect of ongoing Skrailing hostility, internal Norse conflict, and the simple logistics of maintaining a settlement thousands of miles from any support system finally overwhelmed whatever remained of the original ambition. Thorfinn Karlsefni, the expedition leader whose name has become most associated with the Vinland attempt, is presented in the sagas as reaching a clear-eyed conclusion. They now realized, despite everything the land had to offer, they would be under constant threat of attack from its prior inhabitants. They prepared to leave for their own land. That sentence, despite everything the land had to offer, is worth pausing on. It is a sentence that acknowledges, directly and without euphemism, that the failure was not a failure of the land. Vinland was everything the Norse had said it was. Abundant, beautiful, resource-rich in ways that the Norse world desperately needed. The failure was not material, it was human. It was the failure of a group of people to overcome the gap between what they had brought with them and what the situation required. The final engagements between Norse and Skrælings that the sagas describe have the quality of a military withdrawal under pressure. Not a rout, not a catastrophic defeat, but the kind of costly disengagement that leaves no one feeling good about the outcome. The Norse were not simply chased off. They made deliberate choices, held their positions when they needed to, and eventually departed in an organized way. But they departed. What the sagas do not describe, and what would have been the most significant moment in the entire Vinland story, is the last person to leave. The last Norse man or woman to look back at the settlement they had built and the forest that had proved unassailable and turn east. We do not know what that person felt. We do not know whether they felt relief, or shame, or grief, or simply the practical urgency of getting onto the ship before the weather changed. We do not know whether they understood the full significance of what the withdrawal meant. That they were not simply leaving for now, but leaving permanently. That the door behind them was closing in, a way that would not reopen for 5 centuries. What we know is that they left, and the forest closed behind them, and the Skrælings remained, as they had always remained, as they would continue to remain for another 500 years before the next wisps of visitors. From the east arrived a wave with very different numbers, very different diseases, and very different intentions. The Lance o' Meadows site, after the Norse departed, did not remain empty forever. Archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous peoples visited the site at various points after Norse abandonment. They found the turf buildings, the remnants of the forge, the artifacts the Norse had left behind. What they made of these remnants, what stories they told about them, how they incorporated the evidence of the Norse presence into their own understanding of their landscape. These are questions that cannot be fully answered from the archaeological evidence alone. But the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of northeastern North America do contain stories of strange visitors from the sea, pale-skinned people with metal weapons, who came and went. These stories have been collected by ethnographers since the 19th century, and their relationship to the specific Norse Skræling encounters of the early 11th century is debated by specialists, but their existence is significant. The memory of the encounter was preserved, in some form, in the oral traditions of the people who won it. The Norse, by contrast, remembered it as a place they had been and could not keep. A land of abundance that was not theirs to have. A door that had opened and then closed. The word Vinland appears in Norse documents for centuries after the last expedition. In geography texts, in church records, in the accounts of travelers who had heard the stories. It never disappears entirely from the Norse cultural memory. But it is always the same. A place that existed, a place that had been reached, and a place that no one was going back to until 1492, until 1497, until the avalanche began, and by then, the people who had sent the Norse home were 500 years deeper into their knowledge of their continent, their cultures, their landscapes. 500 years more deeply rooted. 500 years more thoroughly at home in the only place they had ever been. It was not enough, in the end, to stop what came next. But that is a different story. The story we are telling tonight is the earlier story. The story of the first meeting, and of the outcome of that first meeting, and of what that outcome tells us about the nature of power, and the limits of military supremacy, and the importance of home. For most of the period since the Vinland sagas were first studied by modern scholars, from the 17th century onward, the story of Norse contact with North America existed in a peculiar liminal, state the sagas were known. The geographic descriptions they contained were detailed enough to be plausible, but there was no physical evidence that was unambiguously Norse in North America, and without physical evidence, the story remained in the category of the historically interesting but unprovable. The discovery of Los Og's Meadows in 1960 changed that decisively, but the 60 years since that discovery have been equally transformative, as a suite of scientific tools has been brought to bear on the Norse Skrælings question that would have been unimaginable to Helge Ingstad when he first walked across the northern tip of Newfoundland and noticed the outlines of structures beneath the turf. Dendrochronology, the science of dating events by analyzing tree rings in preserved wood, has refined the dating of Norse activity at Los Og's Meadows with a precision that radiocarbon dating alone cannot provide. A study published in the journal Nature in 2021, led by archaeologist Michael D. at the University of Groningen, used a particularly sophisticated technique. The team identified a cosmic ray event, a burst of solar radiation that occurred in 992 CE and that left a distinctive chemical signature in tree rings worldwide as a fixed reference point, and then counted forward in tree rings from that signature in Norse timbers found at Los Og's Meadows. The result was a date of exactly 1021 CE for Norse activity at the site, the first time any event in pre-Columbian American history has been precisely dated to a specific calendar year. 1021 CE, the year the Norse were in Vinland, cutting timber, smelting iron, and encountering the people they would call Skrælings, can now be stated as a historical fact, with the same confidence as the date of the Battle of Hastings. Ancient DNA analysis has added another layer to the story. The extraction and analysis of DNA from ancient human remains has transformed our understanding of the population histories of both Europe and the Americas in ways that are still being processed and integrated into the broader historical picture. For the Norse Skrælings story, the most significant ancient DNA finding is not directly about the encounter itself, but about what came after it. Studies of ancient and modern indigenous North American DNA have identified in certain populations descended from the peoples of the northeastern regions small amounts of genetic material that appears to be of European origin, and that is inconsistent with later European contact. Material that, in its genetic character and its geographic distribution, is more consistent with Norse contact in the early medieval period than with the well-documented later European colonizations. This evidence is contested, as ancient DNA evidence in contact situations always is, and the interpretation of small admixture signals requires careful statistical analysis and caution about alternative explanations. But taken alongside the archaeological evidence and the saga accounts, it suggests that the Norse Skræling encounter was not purely a story of violence and separation. There were moments of contact, close enough to leave biological traces. The saga accounts themselves hint at this. They describe Norse captives being taken by Skrælings and Skræling captives being taken by Norse, the latter explicitly noted in the Saga of Eric the Red, which describes Karlsefni's people capturing Two Skrælings boys who were brought back to Greenland and, over time, learned the Norse language well enough to provide information about the geography and peoples of Vinland. Those two boys, whose names are not recorded, whose subsequent fate is not recorded, who appear in the saga only as sources of geographic information, are among the most poignant figures in the entire story. They crossed an ocean. They learned a language. They lived in a world entirely unlike anything they had grown up in. And they passed on what they knew about their own world to the people who had taken them from it. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, the aerial laser scanning technology that has transformed landscape archaeology in Britain and elsewhere, has also been applied to the Lance Ox Meadows site and its surrounding landscape, with results that are still being analyzed. The LiDAR surveys reveal the outlines of features that have been obscured by 1,000 years of vegetation growth and soil accumulation, providing a fuller picture of the spatial extent of Norse activity in the region than surface excavation alone could provide. There are also ongoing genetic studies of plant species, specifically the butternut, a tree native to the northeastern United States but not to Newfoundland, whose shells have been found in Norse contexts at Lasso Meadows. The presence of butternut shells at the site indicates that the Norse, or people in contact with them, had access to trade goods from regions considerably south of Newfoundland, suggesting that the Norse exploration of North America extended further than the single confirmed site might indicate, and that the trade networks connecting the site to the broader indigenous world of northeastern North America were active and functional. The archaeology, in other words, keeps expanding the story, keeps revealing new dimensions of what was a much more complex and much more extensive engagement between Norse and indigenous North American cultures than the broad narrative has previously acknowledged. It was not a simple confrontation. It was not a clean story of invaders and defenders. It was a multi-year, multi-party, regional encounter between two cultural worlds that were, in different ways, operating at the edge of their capabilities, the Norse at the edge of their geographic range, the indigenous peoples at the edge of their experience, with this new and disturbing kind of visitor from the sea. And the physical record of that encounter, preserved in turf and iron slag and tree rings and DNA, is still yielding new information to every generation of scientists who bring new tools to bear on it. The ground remembers what the documents chose to forget. There is a question that this entire story has been building toward, and it is a question about what we actually mean when we use the word civilization. The conventional history of human civilization is a story of expansion, of knowledge spreading outward from its points of origin, of technology diffusing from more complex to less complex societies, of power consolidating from scattered to centralized forms, of the world gradually being organized into larger and larger units of political and economic integration. It is a story in which certain cultures, the cultures that developed writing, cities, metalworking, organized states, are positioned as the carriers of progress, and other cultures, the cultures that lived differently, that organized their knowledge and their power in different forms are positioned as its recipients or its obstacles. The Norse Skrailing encounter does not fit this story, or rather, it fits it only if you ignore the outcome. If you look solely at the technological checklist, writing, metalworking, deep-sea navigation, organized military hierarchy, the Norse score higher than the Skrælings on every measure. But if you look at the actual outcome of the encounter, at who was able to live in the land and who was not, at who made a sustainable relationship with the environment and who could not, at whose knowledge was adequate to the demands of the situation and whose was not, the Skrælings win on every measure. This should prompt a fundamental rethinking of what we mean by sophistication when we apply it to human cultures. The sophistication that matters in the ultimate analysis is not the sophistication of your weapons or your ships or your organizational forms. It is the sophistication of your relationship to the world you actually inhabit. The Skrælings had that relationship in a depth and completeness that the Norse simply could not match in Vinland, regardless of what advantages they brought with them. Because the relationship is not portable. It is specific to a place and a time. And it is built through presence, through the accumulated attention of generations of people living in and with a specific environment over the kind of time. Spans that transform knowledge from information into wisdom. The Norse had wisdom about the North Atlantic. They had wisdom about Scandinavia, about Iceland, about Greenland. They had accumulated, through generations of experience, a body of practical knowledge about those specific environments that was as deep and as sophisticated as the Skrailing knowledge of northeastern North America. The difference was that they could not bring that knowledge with them. They could bring their ships and their iron and their cultural frameworks, but they could not bring the 10,000 years of attention to a specific landscape that was the Skrælings' most important strategic asset. And this is the lesson, the real lesson, the one that applies far beyond the specific circumstances of the Norse Skrailing encounter that the story offers. Power that is portable is not the same as power that belongs. The Norse had portable power, the power of technology, of military skill, of organizational capacity. These assets worked wherever they went, up to a point. But they worked best when the fundamental conditions of the encounter were ones they understood, ones they had experience with, ones that their accumulated knowledge was adequate to. In Vinland, the fundamental conditions were none of those things. The Skrælings had power that belonged. Power that was inseparable from the specific place where it operated, that was the product of relationship rather than possession, that could not be measured on any scale the Norse had for measuring power, and therefore could not be adequately assessed or responded to within the Norse framework. Every empire in history has eventually encountered this distinction. Every projection of power into territory that is not one's own has eventually run up against the limits that the Norse ran up against in Vinland. The limits imposed by not knowing the land, by not knowing the people, by bringing assumptions that do not apply, and frameworks that do not translate. Sometimes those limits are overcome through the sheer weight of numbers and resources, sometimes through the devastating asymmetry introduced by disease, sometimes through the kind of sustained presence that eventually builds over generations, something that begins to resemble the belonging it replaced. But the limits are always there, and the Norse in Vinland, for a brief, remarkable, largely unremembered period at the turn of the first millennium, ran into them in their purest form, against people whose belonging was so complete and whose home advantage was so overwhelming that even the most feared warriors of the medieval world could not overcome it. And now consider the question from the other side. The Skrælings, the people of northeastern North America in 1021 CE, successfully defended their territory against the Norse. They achieved this through a combination of tactical skill, numerical advantage, environmental knowledge, and the simple, overwhelming strategic asset of being home. And then they continued to live as they had always lived, in their forests and on their coasts, for another 500 years before the next visitors came. Those next visitors came in larger numbers, with more diseases and more organizational backing and more willingness to absorb losses. And the story of what happened after 1492 is a story so large and so terrible that it has, understandably, overshadowed the earlier story of the Norse withdrawal from Vinland. But the earlier story matters. It matters because it is a record of a moment when indigenous North American agency was decisive, when the peoples of the continent successfully defended it against the best military culture the medieval world had produced. It is a story of resistance, a story of home, a story of the kind of knowledge that does not fit on any weapons checklist and does not show up in any technological comparison. But that is, in the final accounting of historical outcomes, the most powerful force in human affairs, the knowledge of where you are. And finally, the question we promised to leave you with. If the Norse had succeeded, if Karlsefni's settlement had taken root, had survived the Skræling resistance, had drawn the reinforcements from Greenland and Iceland that a successful colony would eventually have attracted, what would have happened? Would North America have become Vinland? Would the Norse language have spread west as it spread east, carried by the same ships and the same cultural energy that eventually produced the Norse contribution to English, to French, to Russian? Would the indigenous peoples of North America have faced the same kind of gradual displacement and integration that the peoples of Normandy and Ireland and the Danelaw experienced, absorbed into a Norse cultural sphere, their languages and practices surviving in hybrid form rather than being systematically erased? Or would the Norse themselves have been transformed, slowly, generation by generation, through trade and intermarriage and the grinding reality of having to learn to live in a landscape on its own terms into something new, something that was neither Norse nor Skræling, but a combination? The way that every culture in human history that has sustained contact with another culture is eventually a combination. We cannot know. The experiment was not completed. The door closed in 1021 CE, and did not reopen for 5 centuries, and in those 5 centuries, the conditions on both sides of the Atlantic changed enough that when the door opened again, the encounter that followed was so different in its structure and its outcomes that comparison becomes almost meaningless. But the question is worth sitting with. Because it is not just a question about history. It is a question about the paths that were not taken, about the world that might have been, and about the world that actually came to be cost, and for whom. The Norse came to Vinland with iron and ships and 1,000 years of accumulated maritime skill. The Skrælings were already there with 10,000 years of everything else. And for one brief moment, at the very edge of the world, those two forces met and measured themselves against each other. The outcome tells us something important about power, and about home, and about the limits of the kind of supremacy that travels well. The stones at Lance Ox Meadows are still there. The forest is still there. The ocean between the two worlds that met there is still there. And somewhere in the oral traditions of the peoples of northeastern North America, carried in the memories of the descendants of the people who watched from the forest and made their calculations and held their ground. There may still be a memory of the pale strangers who came from the sea and could not stay. We would like to think that memory knows what it was that sent them home. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely. This kind of deep history takes time to absorb, and the fact that you are still here matters. Drop a comment below with your answer to the question we ended on. If the Norse had succeeded in Vinland, what do you think North America would look like today? We read every comment. If this video gave you something, a new perspective, a story you had not heard before, a question you want to keep thinking about, share it. The algorithm does not find videos like this on its own. It depends on people who care about history, caring enough to tell other people about it. Subscribe if you want more. There are 1,000 more stories like this one. Stories of the encounters that history forgot. The civilizations that did not fit the standard narrative. The moments that changed everything and then disappeared into silence. We are not finished telling them.